I'm Elara Monroe. They called me the failure of a $1 billion family. At dinner, they praised my brother, the heir, the genius. Me, I was invisible. Until I unlocked the basement sealed for 40 years, inside proof of international money laundering under my brother's name. And a final message from Grandpa, you're the last hope. From forgotten daughter to the one who could bring it all down. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now for more shocking and emotional films like this. Before all the secrets unraveled, I thought the worst thing was a silent family dinner. But no one told me there was a war buried beneath our floor. I am Elara Monroe. The name probably doesn't ring a bell unless you're deeply embedded in the world of East Coast legacy finance, or you've memorized the surnames stamped on the plaques of ivy-covered buildings and skyscrapers that cast long shadows over cities. But even if the name means something to you, I probably don't. Because in the Monroe family, I'm the daughter no one ever waits for at dinner. No seat was ever pulled out for me. No wine poured in advance. No glance toward the door when the clock struck the hour. If I showed up, surprise. If I didn't, no one noticed. I learned young that some names open doors, but some daughters are born only to guard them from the other side. I was 19 when I stood at the front steps of the Monroe estate, a single duffel bag in hand, refusing the offer letter to Columbia that father had spent an entire year negotiating behind my back. I had made my choice. Art school. Illustration. The exact path he'd once called a hobby for trust fund orphans and bored housewives. His words, not mine. He didn't yell when I told him, didn't raise his voice. He just blinked twice, folded his newspaper in half, and said with precise indifference, "Then you're no longer my problem." That was my inheritance, indifference polished like silver. Grayson stood by the marble banister behind him, looking down at me like I was a museum exhibit he'd already seen and was done with. "You're being dramatic," he said, smiling in that way he always did, like charm could cover up contempt. I walked away. That was 10 years ago. Grayson, of course, took the Columbia slot. Graduated top of his class, MBA from Wharton, fast-tracked into Monroe Holdings by 24. By 28, he was already a Forbes feature. Our father used to call him the chosen one. Now he just calls him the future. And me? I'm 29 now. I live above a second-hand bookstore in South End, Boston. The floors creak, the radiator whistles like a dying tea kettle, and the ceiling leaks when the snow thaws too quickly. But the light! It hits the north wall in the late morning and turns every blank canvas into a cathedral. That's enough. At least most days. This morning there were 5 unanswered emails from a gallery in Cambridge, wondering if my work would be ready in time. 2 bills I couldn't ignore. 1 rejection letter from a grant I'd applied to under a pseudonym, and a voicemail from my landlord about the pipes freezing again. That's how the day began, with all the typical noise. But then between the unpaid invoices and the unanswered calls, I found something strange in my mailbox. A letter. Not a typed envelope, not a stamp with a digital bar, but real ink, real parchment, real effort. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, slanted, controlled. Maxwell Monroe, my grandfather. The man who hadn't spoken to me since the funeral of my grandmother 5 years ago when I'd accidentally knocked over a wine glass onto his cashmere sleeve. He hadn't said a word to me then, just looked at the stain, then at me, and walked away. But now here was his handwriting, on a letter addressed only to me. I sat at the edge of my studio window with trembling fingers and opened it. The note was brief, efficient, not flowery. Elara. This Friday, 7 p.m., Monroe Estate, family financial supper. Your presence is required. Maxwell. That was it. No signature flourish, no love, no reason. Just required. I stared at the paper like it might grow a second paragraph. It didn't. Why now? Why me? I hadn't seen the inside of that estate in nearly a decade. I hadn't been invited to any of the mergers, brunches, galas, funerals, or boardroom birthdays. I wasn't in the family group chat. I didn't even know there was a family group chat until last Christmas when my mother accidentally sent me a photo meant for someone else. And now out of nowhere I was being summoned. I didn't know whether to laugh, scream, or throw the letter into the fireplace. But there wasn't a fireplace in my studio apartment, just a space heater that occasionally spat sparks, so I poured myself stale coffee instead. I stared out the window. Across the street, a girl in a pea coat was painting her nails on the curb. Someone's dog was barking at a pigeon with manic conviction. Life was as it always was, ordinary, chaotic, safe. And yet, the paper in my hand felt heavier than its weight. I told myself I didn't care, that I wouldn't go, that it was a trap, or a performance, or worse, some twisted ploy to humiliate me under the guise of olive branches and champagne. But something sat wrong in my chest. It wasn't the letter, it was the timing. Maxwell Monroe wasn't the kind of man who issued invites lightly. If he wanted you, he summoned. If he didn't, you were forgotten. Like a typo in a press release, quietly erased. And this felt like neither. It felt like a warning, or a test, or both. That night, I pulled the suitcase from under my bed, the same one I had carried when I left home 10 years ago. The zippers were stiff. One of the wheels stuck. But it still held everything I needed: a black dress that didn't wrinkle, boots that looked more expensive than they were, and a necklace my mother gave me when I was 13 and never remembered. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at my reflection. Not the girl who left Monroe Manor crying into the cuffs of a flannel jacket. Not the one who once begged to be seen. This version of me didn't beg. She didn't scream. She painted, she built, she stood. And now apparently she was going back. I packed the letter last, folding it into the inside pocket of my coat. Just before I zipped the suitcase shut, I slipped in one other item: a paintbrush. I didn't know why. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was defiance. But part of me suspected, if this story was about to be rewritten, I wanted to make sure I brought my own brush. The Monroe estate hadn't changed. The same wrought iron gates. The same gravel that crunched like glass beneath your tires. The same sterile symmetry of hedges trimmed with militaristic precision, standing like green soldiers beneath a gray sky. But something was different. The air. It didn't hum with power the way it used to. It breathed colder now, like a house that had held its breath too long. The car door hadn't even fully opened when I heard his voice. Miss Elara, Theo, the estate's oldest ghost in human form. Part butler, part shadow, part secret keeper. He looked exactly as I remembered him: gray suit, silver gloves, face lined like an old topographical map of restraint. He opened my door with the same gentleness he used when I was 6 and scraped my knee on the garden steps. I stepped out. The wind lifted my coat slightly, and with it my spine. "Welcome home," he said softly. Voice like tea left too long in the pot. "This was never home," I murmured back. But he only smiled. "The library is lit. You'll want to go there first. They've already started." The phrase wasn't unusual, but the pause before "already started" that felt like something wrapped in thorns. I followed him through the grand entry. The doors, tall and arched, like they led to cathedrals, closed behind me with a dull, definitive sound. I could hear voices down the hall, over-polished, overly pleasant, and utterly performative. I walked slowly past portraits that never seemed to look at you, only through you. The ancestors, all men with pocket watches and all women with pearl necklaces, watched silently from their frames, judging the living with oil-stained authority. Then I stepped into the dining room. There it was, the performance. Long table, obscenely long. Candles flickered in silver holders, napkins folded into the shape of lilies, champagne coupes clinked like crystal lies. Every seat was filled, every eye turned, except for one. Grayson, of course. He stood at the head of the table, glass in hand, mid-sentence, his favorite place to be. "Elara," he said smoothly, like he was tasting the name for the first time in years and finding it only slightly sour. Glad you could finally make it, finally. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Wouldn't want to miss the theater. My father stood before anyone else could react. Grayson was just sharing news about our Q3 international numbers, he said, pride dripping from his mouth like expensive syrup. We've entered the soul market. Negotiations were tight, but he pulled it off. He clapped Grayson's back with theatrical satisfaction. No mention of me. No, you look well. No, we missed you. Not even a nod. Just like always. Grayson gestured toward the last empty seat, mine next to him, of course. The trap was always polite. As I slid into the chair, I caught glimpses of old faces. Uncle Martin, who once said I was too sensitive to handle wealth. Aunt Cecily, who gave me grief for not wearing heels to my grandmother's memorial. And Charlotte, the cousin who stole my sketchbook in 8th grade and turned it in as her own for an art award. All of them were here, all smiling, all pretending. Dinner began. Lobster tail with saffron foam, duck with cherry gastrique. The usual decadence served on porcelain older than most nations. Conversation orbited Grayson like he was the sun. Brilliant handling of the Indonesian joint venture. Your strategy on the energy acquisition visionary. Grayson, what's next for Monroe Holdings? He handled it all with a smile carved from marble. Every answer charming. Every nod calculated. My wine glass remained half empty, my plate untouched. No one asked about me, not once. Not about the exhibition I'd curated for a women's shelter downtown. Not about the murals I'd painted in schoolyards in Roxbury. Not even about how I'd been surviving. Because survival wasn't a currency they respected. At one point, my mother leaned over her pearl earrings, bobbing with importance. You look thinner, dear. Are you eating enough? I'm painting, I replied. She frowned as if I'd said I was doing drugs. When the souffle came out, because of course it ended with souffle, I finally looked around and asked, "Where's Grandpa?" The question shattered the table's rhythm. Glasses paused mid-sip, forks slowed, eyes blinked. My mother recovered first. He's resting, she said. He tires easily these days. It was the kind of sentence that begged no follow-up, and yet, we're here for him, I pressed. Father cleared his throat. He trusts us to handle things in his stead. Us, not me. I stared across the table at Grayson, who smirked ever so slightly before returning to his glass of Pinot. The room resumed its artificial tempo, but I had already seen the crack. When dinner ended, people dispersed in pairs, polished shoes against antique floors, sighs of contentment, quiet power humming through silk ties and diamond cuffs. I lingered, waiting for Theo to reappear. He did, as always in the space between attention and silence. "Elara," he whispered as I passed him in the hallway. I turned. He motioned with just his eyes toward the servants' corridor. I followed without asking. Down the narrow hallways, past the kitchen which smelled like lemon oil and old fear, toward the back of the house where paintings didn't hang and no one used their real voices. He led me to the laundry room, closed the door. Only then did he reach into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and pull out a small rusted key. I stared. "Your grandfather left this for you? No one else?" Why, I asked. Theo looked at me, and for the first time in my life, his eyes looked old, not wise, just weary. "Because he doesn't trust anyone anymore," he said. "But he trusts you." I looked down at the key. It was heavy for its size. Brass, scratched, etched with 3 letters I hadn't seen in years. VLR Vincent Laurent Room. The basement. The door that had been locked since before I was born. I looked back up. "What's in there?" Theo didn't blink. He said you needed to see it, before morning. Before I could respond, he opened the door behind me. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there alone, key in hand. The house creaked above me like it was remembering something it wasn't supposed to. I held the key tight, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just suspicious. I was scared. Not because of what I might find in that room, but because of what might already know I was coming. The grandfather clock in the east corridor struck midnight. 3 chimes, slow, deliberate. like a warning, like the house itself was counting down. I moved like a shadow. No shoes, just thick socks sliding across polished marble. One hand tracing the wall for balance, the other gripping the small brass key Theo had pressed into my palm hours earlier. I knew where the Vincent Laurent room was. Everyone in the family did. It was whispered about at parties, joked about by cousins who thought secret rooms were cute. But no one ever opened that door. No one had the key. Until now. The door lived in the West Wing's basement hallway down a steep set of stairs that curved like a rib cage into the earth. The walls narrowed the deeper you went, as if the house was warning you you're not supposed to be here. The flashlight on my phone barely cut through the darkness. My breath fogged in the cold air. The walls were damp, stone-lined, and smelled faintly of iron and mold. I stopped in front of the door. It was smaller than I remembered. Wooden, black, reinforced with vertical iron bands like a medieval vault. There was no handle, only a single keyhole in the shape of a lion's eye. The letters VLR were carved into the frame, aged to the point of near erasure. I took the key from my coat pocket. It slid in with a metallic click. The door didn't resist. It simply opened. The hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. I stepped into darkness, and then the smell hit me. Dust mostly, but underneath that metal, like dried blood on old steel, the kind of smell that settles in your nose and doesn't leave. I aimed my flashlight around. The room wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 15. No windows. Stone walls covered in faded blueprints curling at the corners like forgotten parchment prayers. Against the back wall sat a tall, rusted cabinet, padlocked. Next to it, a safe. Real, physical, not digital. The kind of safe you'd only open if you were very old, very paranoid, or both. I moved toward it like someone in a dream. The combination was taped under the base beneath a strip of masking tape that read only Elara. I didn't even flinch. My fingers moved automatically as if they'd known this sequence since birth. As if I'd been opening this lock in my sleep. 32-9-71. The tumblers clicked. The safe door creaked open. Inside files, folders, a small hard drive, a leather-bound journal, and wrapped in a piece of dark velvet, a cassette tape. No label, no date. Just a single strip of masking tape with one word. Listen. I took everything out, laid it gently on the old drafting table in the center of the room. My fingers trembled. I opened the first folder. Inside were architectural plans for over 24 large-scale projects, high-rise developments in Lagos, resort islands in the Philippines, retirement enclaves in Arizona, smart urban housing complexes in Germany, all of them stamped with the Monroe Holdings logo. But these weren't ordinary blueprints. These were altered, redacted overlays, environmental impact studies with pages missing, alternate designs that gutted sustainability features, illegal rezoning modifications, and attached to each one a note from my grandfather. In his familiar handwriting, meticulous, angular, ink bled just slightly into the old paper. Original design preserved. Revised version signed under duress. Grayson approved illegal cost-saving measures. Use of offshore accounts detected in Manila project. Core design values violated. Ethical failure unacceptable. I read page after page, each one a punch to the gut. This wasn't business, this was betrayal. And Grayson wasn't just complicit. He was orchestrating it. These weren't accidents, they were patterns, repeated, perfected. Then I opened the journal. My grandfather's voice poured from the pages like a confession and an indictment all at once. Elara sees design the way it was meant to be seen, as legacy. Grayson sees it as leverage. There's a cost to building without conscience, one I've watched this family ignore for too long. If you're reading this, it means I'm out of time or out of power, and I need you to see what they've done so you know why this empire must be rebuilt or buried. I didn't know I was crying until a drop landed on the paper and bled the ink. I set the journal aside, picked up the cassette. The old tape recorder was sitting in the cabinet drawer beneath the safe, just as dusty but intact. I pushed the tape in. It began with static, then his voice, raspy. Slower than I remembered, but still his. If you're listening to this, Elara, then the house is already eating itself. Grayson is using Monroe Holdings to funnel assets into international shell corporations. The environmental reports are falsified. The philanthropic fronts are covers. He's using the brand to wash the filth clean. And he's not alone. The board, they've seen enough to suspect, but they're complicit by silence. I've spent 60 years building this name, but names mean nothing without integrity. You're the only one I trust to do what I couldn't, not because you're obedient, but because you're not. Silence followed. I sat there, heart pounding against my ribs like fists on a locked door. All these years, they called me the failure, the runaway, the dreamer, the disappointment. But all the while they had been rotting from the inside, and he'd seen it. He'd known. He hadn't given me a throne. He'd given me a match, a chance to choose rebuild it or burn it down. I sat there in that dusty crypt of secrets, remembering all the times he watched me sketch as a child. Art with teeth, he once called it. Pretty isn't enough, he said. Make something true. Make something that holds. When the winds come, and they will come, you'll find out who built for beauty and who built for survival. I thought he was talking about buildings. I was wrong. He was talking about bloodlines, about empires, about Grayson. I wiped my face with my sleeve and closed the safe. I repacked the files, hid them in my tote bag beneath my sketchbook and scarf. I made sure the tape was back in its velvet wrap. I folded the journal. I pressed the folder edges flat so no one could see the wear. I put the key back in my coat pocket, and I walked upstairs. Not fast, not slow, like someone who knew that no matter how quiet the night seemed, someone was already awake and listening. I passed the parlor, empty, the dining room, silent. But in the hallway mirror, I caught the briefest glimpse, a flicker of movement behind me, a shoulder disappearing behind the banister. Someone had been watching, and I knew this wasn't just inheritance anymore. This was war. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not with the truth buried and the rot still dressed in tuxedos and title deeds. I would stay. I would watch. And I would wait. Because now I knew what was hidden. And the ones who had buried it had no idea that the forgotten daughter was about to become the one holding the detonator. I woke to the vibration of a text that shouldn't have come through. No Wi-Fi. No cell signal in the guest rooms. That had always been a Monroe rule. No distractions during family weekends. Togetherness, they called it. Surveillance, I always thought. But my phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with an alert. Not a message, not a missed call. Unknown device requesting location access. Then another. Your microphone is currently in use. My pulse slowed, not sped, the kind of stillness that comes before a burn. I sat up. The phone felt like it was buzzing against my skin rather than in my hand. I opened settings, scrolled, checked permissions. A strange app blinked back at me, one I hadn't downloaded, one that wasn't there yesterday. It had no name, just a dot, a black icon. Tapping it did nothing. Holding it crashed the phone. And just like that, I knew. Someone in this house was watching me. Knew I had opened the safe. Knew I had heard the tape. I stood up carefully, the way you do when you think someone might already be in the room. The guest suite looked the same. The curtain slightly parted, the tray of untouched tea on the dresser, the door still locked. But I didn't feel alone. I powered the phone off, wrapped it in a silk scarf, slid it under the loose floorboard beneath the wardrobe. It wouldn't save me, but it might buy me time. I dressed quickly, neutral tones. Black jeans, gray jacket, hair tied back, no jewelry. Then I slid the tote bag over my shoulder. Inside, the copies carefully folded architectural blueprints, scanned versions of the journal entries, and a digital recording of the tape uploaded to a blank USB I carried in my art kit. The originals were too risky to keep with me, and I already knew where to hide them. The west hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil and cold secrets. I slipped through just after sunrise, boots silent on the old floor. Grandfather's room sat at the end of the hall door, still shut. No one had been inside it since his resting had become indefinite. Inside, the scent hit me, old cologne, faded books, the unmistakable musk of a room kept closed too long. His fireplace was sealed, the hearth empty. But just above it, behind the false panel, I found it. The old 19th century chimney flue he once called the estate's lungs. I wrapped the journal in plastic, slid the blueprints inside a portfolio tube, tucked them both behind the bricks just past reach of ash, but far enough no one would stumble upon them without knowing what they were looking for. Then I sealed it shut. The room fell still. I stood there for a long moment, watching dust drift in the morning light like falling time. I could almost hear him. "Build what holds, not what dazzles," he'd said. "When the winds come, beauty breaks. Foundation holds." I left his room without turning back. Downstairs, the dining room had already come to life. The Monroe family did not do casual mornings. Even breakfast had structure. French press coffee, sliced melon, eggs served under domes. And Grayson, already in a tailored navy suit, hair perfectly in place, smiling as if nothing in the world had ever crumbled beneath his feet. He was mid-story recounting something about Zurich when he spotted me. "Elara," he said, too smooth, too neutral. "We were just wondering when the artist would emerge." I sat, buttered toast, didn't answer. He waited, then leaned slightly forward. "You must be finding inspiration here. I hear the decay of legacy makes for excellent abstract work." Laughter twitched across the table. My mother smiled politely. My father didn't look up from the business section. "Not really," I replied. "Too many perfect surfaces, not enough honest texture." He blinked, tilted his head. "But perhaps I should paint this breakfast. All these curated expressions, controlled bites, forks held at angles like daggers dressed in linen." Silence. A single clink of porcelain. Grayson chuckled, "The kind that means I see you." "So dramatic," he said. "Still composing monologues in your head, I see." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Still laundering ethics behind quarterly reports?" His smile thinned, barely, but it was there. Across the table, my mother cleared her throat. I excused myself after coffee, claiming I had errands in town. No one protested. They didn't believe in errands that weren't about profit. But I had a destination, an address etched in my memory. 14 Willow Street, Montbury. A quiet colonial house behind a rusted gate. The home of the man who once served as Monroe Holdings' legal compass before his conscience made him resign. Mr. Laird, my grandfather's oldest advisor, the one who had helped him build not just contracts but boundaries. I slipped out through the side door, walked past the garden, past the fountain with the dried ivy, past the bench where Grayson and I once buried a shoebox of childhood drawings, only to have him dig it up and burn mine when I left for art school. The rental car waited near the outer gate. No one stopped me. But as I merged onto the main road, I saw it. A black sedan in the rearview mirror. Nothing unusual, except it followed through every turn, every detour. I took the long way around the old quarry road, up a loop toward an abandoned chapel. And still the sedan followed. I turned off onto a gravel stretch, stopped near the edge of a clearing, got out slowly. The car didn't drive past. It stopped 50 yards back, engine humming. The driver's door opened, and there he was, Grayson. No suit jacket now, just dress shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, expression unreadable. "You missed a turn," he said. "No," I replied. "I didn't." He stepped closer, hands in pockets. We stood in the silence of dry leaves and invisible tension. "What are you doing, Elara?" "Going to see someone." "Who?" "Someone with a better compass than you." He tilted his head. "You think you know something." I didn't answer. "I'm guessing you've been in the basement." Still silence. "And I'm guessing you found things you don't understand." "You sound nervous," I said. He laughed, but it was sharp now, not casual, not charming. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "You think you've uncovered some great secret? You think you're going to drag this family into the light like some noble heroine. I said nothing. You want to know what happens when you play hero in a world built by wolves? He continued, stepping closer. You get eaten. Quietly. Completely. No one even remembers your name. He was close now. Too close. But I didn't flinch. Then you'd better make sure I disappear before I start speaking, I said. His eyes narrowed. I'm not the girl you burned drawings from anymore, I said. And I turned, got in the car, shut the door, drove away. He didn't follow. Not yet. But I felt him watching. And for the first time I didn't care. Because the wolves had finally seen the match in my hand. The house at 14 Willow Street was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just gotten older, taller, colder, harder. The hedges hadn't been trimmed in months. Paint peeled from the porch columns. A wind chime made of rusted keys swung in the breeze like it was warning me off. But the lights were on. Someone was still inside. I rang the bell. The door opened only halfway, and there he was. Laird, hair whiter, eyes sharper. Time hadn't dulled him, it had carved him into something leaner like a blade used just enough to cut clean. Elara Monroe, he said, not with surprise, but like he'd been waiting for the day. Mr. Laird, I said, I need to talk. He stepped aside, no questions, no pleasantries, just enough silence to say everything. His home smelled like paper and citrus wood, the kind of place where things are filed before they're felt. He led me to his study, shelves to the ceiling, maps, an old chessboard in mid-game pieces frozen in confrontation. He gestured toward the leather armchair across from his. I assume this isn't a social visit, he said. No, I said. It's about my grandfather, and Grayson. His jaw didn't clench, his hands didn't flinch, but his eyes, they narrowed just slightly. A crack behind glass. Show me what you've found, he said. I slid the USB from my pocket, placed it on the table between us. I made copies, I said. The originals are safe. He nodded. Plugged it into a weathered laptop. The files opened like wounds, the blueprints, the altered zoning permits, the journal scans, and finally the audio file. He listened in silence. Not a single interruption, not a single note taken. When the recording ended, he sat back slowly. You found the sealed room, he said. I nodded. He left the key for me. He steepled his fingers. I always suspected he might. Toward the end, he stopped trusting the board. He stopped trusting most people, to be honest. I leaned forward. Tell me everything. And so he did. The Texas project was the beginning, he said, an industrial build near Del Rio, originally meant to be a sustainable redevelopment zone. Green infrastructure, local partnerships. But halfway through, Grayson slashed every ethical provision from the plan without board approval. My heart ticked louder in my chest. Your grandfather tried to block it. But Grayson had already seeded the board with loyalists. People who owed him favors, kickbacks, or secrets. Why didn't Grandpa fire him, I asked. He tried, Laird said, voice flat. But the bylaws had changed. Quietly. Subtly. Over time. Maxwell still held majority influence, but not the authority he once thought. I swallowed hard. So he made that room, I said, and began documenting everything Laird finished. But not to go public, not yet. He was building something else. A structural fallback plan. A way to reclaim control without letting it rot further. He stood, walked to a locked cabinet, opened it with a key on a chain around his neck. From inside, he retrieved a thick-bound set of papers, gray leather cover seal embossed in gold. Monroe Ethical Trust, charter draft. He laid it in my lap. What is this, I asked. His last strategy, he said. Unpublished, never filed, never signed, but complete. I opened the cover. My name was on the first page. Elara Monroe, I read aloud. Appointed sole beneficiary and temporary steward with oversight power for all operations related to... I stopped. It was all there. A plan to restructure Monroe Holdings into a semi-public, ethically governed enterprise backed by independent watchdogs, community-driven initiatives, and a legal firewall against internal corruption. And he'd written it with me in mind. "Why me?" I whispered. Laird looked me dead in the eyes. "Because you see value beyond valuation," he said. "You were never interested in ownership. That's exactly why he trusted you to protect it." The weight of it landed like cold iron in my stomach. "You can activate it," Laird said. "It's legal, binding. All it needs is your signature and a formal presentation to the board." I shook my head. "If I do that now, they'll bury it. Grayson will have it shredded before it ever reaches a vote." Laird leaned back, nodded. "You're right," he said. "You'll need leverage. Proof, timing." I closed the book, my mind spinning. "I don't want the company," I said quietly. "But I won't let it be turned into a crime scene wrapped in linen." He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "You're your grandfather's granddaughter," he said. I stood. There was only one next step. I couldn't take this to the board. Not yet. Not to the press. Not to the family. I had to make him say it. "Grayson, on record. Not for me, not for vengeance, but for the truth." I thanked Mr. Laird. He gave me the charter copy and a burner phone. "Trust nothing that came from them," he said, meaning the house, the devices, the people. I didn't reply. I already knew. The drive back to the estate felt shorter, but my mind was miles ahead. I replayed our last conversation at the quarry, the threat hidden under his calm. The way he said, "You think you know something," like I hadn't even begun. I did now. At the gate, I parked, shut off the car, pulled out the burner, typed a message. "To Grayson, I know about Texas. Tonight, 10 p.m., East Wing Gallery. Come alone." I hit send, stared at the screen until the status changed to read. No reply. But he would come, because men like Grayson didn't run from accusations. They ran to control the narrative. The East Wing of the Monroe estate was the only place no one visited at night. It used to house the family's private gallery, an old art hall that hadn't been updated since the 80s. Dust collected in corners, frames hung crooked, and oil paintings of past Monroes stared out with faces that were both too real and too distant. But the acoustics were sharp, and the silence was absolute. Perfect for what I needed. I arrived early 9:35 p.m. No lights. I entered through the servants' stairwell, the same one we used to sneak through as kids when we weren't supposed to be out of bed. The doorknob still squeaked. The floorboards still remembered where to groan. In the center of the gallery stood a long walnut table. Beneath it, I taped the audio recorder, checked the battery. Full, red light blinking like a steady heartbeat. Next, I laid the Texas project folder open on the table. Not the copy, the real one. Stamped, annotated, signed. Beside it, the journal entry referencing bribed zoning officials and illegal land repurposing. Let him see it. Let him believe I was reckless enough to show my hand. Sometimes bait has to look fragile. By 9:58, I was standing alone in the middle of the room, arms folded, expression blank. The only light came from the single stained glass window in the back, casting fractured colors across the floor like a church at war with itself. At 10:01 he arrived. No knock, no announcement, just the sound of soft leather soles on marble. Grayson Monroe entered like a man stepping onto a stage he helped design. Black shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled, not casual, calculated. He closed the door behind him, didn't speak. His eyes went straight to the table, then to me, then back to the folder. "You really are your grandfather's favorite little ghost," he said. I said nothing. He walked slowly to the table. His fingers skimmed the papers, barely touching. Then he let out a soft laugh, just one note, bitter and amused. "You think this is checkmate?" I finally spoke. "I think you know exactly what this is." He picked up the Texas blueprint, held it to the light. "These were sealed." "No," I corrected. "They were buried." He looked up. "And you dug them up. Why?" "To see if you'd still recognize yourself in them," I said. He set the paper down, looked at me carefully. "You don't get it, Elara. You never have. These documents, they're just drawings, lines and numbers. The real decisions don't happen on paper. They happen in rooms like this. between people who know how the world works. Then explain it to me, I said, voice calm. Explain how falsifying compliance reports and laundering assets through shell corporations is how the world works. You don't want an explanation, he snapped. You want a confession. No, I said. I already have that. His eyes flicked toward the table. What did you record? Does it matter, I asked. You're already talking. He stepped forward, rage creeping up his spine like fire in wallpaper. You always hated me, he said. Because I could do what you couldn't. Be who you wouldn't. You'd rather starve in a loft painting your emotions than make actual change. You call this change, I asked? You turned our family name into a currency for laundering power. He barked a laugh. Spare me the poetry, Elara. You were never going to be part of this. Even now you're just playing rebel in a family you left. I stepped closer. You're right, I said. I did leave. Because I thought it wasn't worth saving. But I was wrong. There's still something under the rot worth holding on to. You think you're going to fix it? He asked, voice rising. With a tape recorder and a file folder. I didn't answer. He moved toward me, slow and deliberate. You want to destroy me? He whispered. That's what this is about? No, I said. I want you to answer for what you've done. For once. To anyone. To something. He paused. And for the first time, something cracked behind his eyes. Just a flicker. A fracture in the confidence. You don't get to walk into this world 10 years late and claim a moral high ground. I'm not claiming anything, I said. I'm exposing it. His mouth opened, ready to launch another attack. But the door creaked behind us. Grayson froze. We both turned. Our father stood in the doorway. No tie. No jacket, just an open-collar shirt and eyes like a man who'd heard too much too soon. Silence. Grayson straightened. You followed me. I did, our father said quietly. He stepped into the room, slowly, like walking through fog. What is this? He asked. I said nothing. Grayson looked between us, his tongue pressed hard to the inside of his cheek. His control was slipping. Dad, she's spinning stories. She's got old documents irrelevant. Things from years ago. Grandpa fed her paranoia, and now she's trying to martyr herself. Our father turned to me. Elara, is that true? I didn't blink. No. But you already knew that. He didn't respond. Grayson stepped forward, jaw clenched. You're going to take her side after everything I've done for this family. I didn't come here to take sides, our father said. Then why are you here? Grayson asked, voice cracking for the first time. To see if what I've been hearing in whispers is true. Grayson laughed bitterly. Whispers. From who? From Theo. From the ghost of Grandpa's disappointment. You think I've done something wrong? Say it. Father looked at him, eyes tired. I stopped paying attention. The words landed harder than a shout. Grayson reeled back like he'd been hit. I let things run because I thought success meant righteousness. Our father continued. You kept the company profitable. You did everything I asked, but I never asked how. And now, what Grayson demanded, you're going to believe she's the moral compass she left this family. She ran. No, I said softly now. I saw what we were becoming, and I stepped away so I wouldn't become it too. Our father looked at me again. Something unreadable passed through his face. Grayson's fists were clenched. He turned back to the table, saw the folder again. Then without warning, he reached for it. I was faster. I grabbed it first, held it against my chest. You touch this, I said, and I will drag everything into the light. He stared at me, breathing hard, but he didn't move. And in that frozen moment, I knew he had nothing left but threats. I stepped around him, past our father, paused in the doorway. I'm done talking, I said. Now it's your turn. I left the room. The hallway outside was darker than before, but I felt lighter. I took the side stairs to the back corridor, made my way to Theo's quarters. He opened the door before I knocked, as if he'd known. I handed him the recorder, the second copy of the file, and the charter. Get it to him, I said. He nodded. No words, just the gravity of history shifting hands. They called it a legacy assembly, a term that once meant honor ceremony celebration. Tonight it felt like a trap. The family had gathered in the great hall. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, the crest of Monroe Holdings carved in stone above the fireplace like a god that had long stopped listening. Every chair was filled. Grayson at the center, my father next to him, uncles, aunts, cousins, all in their tailored silk, all cloaked in the silent tension of a room about to fracture. I stood near the back, not among them, but not hiding. A single screen was set up at the front. Theo adjusted the laptop and placed a small remote in my hand. "This is all he could manage," he whispered, "but it's enough." I pressed play. The lights dimmed, and my grandfather appeared, gray, thin, sitting in a chair that dwarfed him. But his voice when it came was still sharp, still Monroe. "If you're watching this," he began, "it means I'm no longer able to speak freely. It also means the board has refused to act and my son is still silent." Grayson shifted in his seat. My father didn't move. My grandfather looked into the camera as if he saw each of us. For over 4 decades, I built Monroe Holdings with the belief that capital could serve something more than greed. I was wrong. A murmur spread through the room. He continued, "Over the past 5 years, under Grayson Monroe's direct influence, our company has engaged in financial laundering, environmental violations, and the exploitation of labor in at least 4 international projects." Gasps, but no denials. "Documents and recordings proving this have been secured and will be delivered to legal authorities unless internal reforms are enacted. I have signed over the founding equity, my shares, my voting power, my seal, not to the board, nor my son, but to Elara Monroe." The room froze. You could feel it like a shift in air pressure, a silence so deep it had weight. Grayson stood. "That's a lie," he said, loud and cold. "This is manipulation. Fabricated. She made this." He pointed at me like a man on trial with no defense but fury. "This is her revenge. She edits video, she paints stories. Of course she could fake a clip." He turned to the others. "You've known me. I've been here. I've led every project, every acquisition. She hasn't stepped foot in this house in years." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Theo stepped forward, calm, controlled. He placed a small black speaker on the table. Pressed play. Grayson's voice filled the room. Crystal clear, from the gallery. "You want a confession, no? I already have that. You were never gonna be part of this." "You want to destroy me? That's what this is about." His tone, his words, the arrogance, the contempt. Every syllable became a nail in the illusion he'd built. When the audio ended, no one spoke. Even Grayson couldn't. His face paled, jaw tight, eyes wide with the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. My father looked down at the floor, and then quietly he stood. "I heard the rumors," he said, "but I never asked for proof, because proof meant responsibility." He turned to me. "You have it." And just like that, the room began to divide. Uncle Martin stood and crossed his arms. "So now we hand the company over to an idealist with a sketch pad," Aunt Lillian responded. "At least she didn't use it as a laundering machine." Someone clapped. Someone else cursed. The room fractured like glass under pressure. Pledges, accusations, justifications, all flying in tones too fast and too loud to track. But I didn't speak. I watched. And when it reached the edge of chaos, when Grayson's voice started to rise again, desperate, defensive, I stepped forward, and I said only one thing. I declined the inheritance. Silence again. Real heavy silence. What Grayson asked stunned. "I won't take the company," I repeated. "Not as it is. Not as a symbol. Not as a throne carved from broken trust." "You can't," he began, but my voice cut clean through. "I didn't do this for power," I said. "I did it for light." I turned to the crowd, to the people who had once looked through me as if I didn't exist. "You built a legacy that fed itself, that devoured itself. But I believe there's still something beneath it worth saving." I stepped to the fireplace, held up the folder, the charter of the Ethical Oversight Council our grandfather never got to establish. "This is what I'll take. The right to rebuild accountability. To create something that doesn't need a Monroe name to matter." My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter, because I had never spoken truer words in my life. Theo stepped beside me. The council's framework has already been submitted to state legal review. If enough shareholders vote for it, oversight will shift in 3 months. My father nodded. I'll be the first to sign. Behind me, voices began to stir. Not everyone agreed, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't about agreement. It was about exposure, about a truth that once seen couldn't be unseen. And Grayson, he sat down, slowly, as if the weight of everything he built finally settled on his shoulders all at once. No more shouting, no more defense, just silence. Because what do you say when the mirror cracks and your reflection doesn't blink? I left the room after that. Not in victory, not in shame, but in clarity. Out the main doors, into the night air, where the wind didn't lie and the stars didn't pick sides. Theo followed. He didn't speak, just handed me an envelope, a letter from my grandfather, sealed in wax. I opened it later that night alone. It read, "You were never invisible, Elara. You were the part we refused to see, the soul, the conscience. If this family survives, it'll be because of that. Not because of walls, but because of light." With trust your grandfather, I folded the letter, placed it in my sketchbook, and for the first time in years I began to draw. Not buildings, not chaos, but the outline of a sunrise coming through broken glass. They called it Foundation M. Not Monroe, not Holdings, not Legacy, just M. Elara never explained what the M stood for. Maybe it was Monroe. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was a match lit in a house built on lies. What mattered was this. She built it not to replace the empire, but to expose what the empire had buried. The old stone basement, once sealed, once shadowed, was gutted and transformed. Gone were the crates of documents hidden behind cobwebs. Now long tables lined the room, buzzing with quiet intensity. Screens flickered with forensic audits. Legal pads filled with scribbled timelines. On the wall, a hand-drawn map of every offshore account Monroe Holdings had ever touched. Elara stood at the head of it all, not as a CEO, but as a woman who had bled through silence, and now spoke in thunder. By 51 the first thing she did was bring them back the ones the system had thrown out. Malik Reyes, a former risk analyst who once flagged unexplainable gaps in a shipping deal and was fired for unprofessional tone. Sophia Yuan, a junior compliance officer who refused to sign off on a real estate deal in Bangladesh and was blacklisted in 3 countries. And Jonah Adler, a whistleblower from the London office who had once emailed the board anonymously, only to find his apartment broken into a week later. They returned not for revenge but for truth, because someone finally believed their voices mattered. Elara didn't give them titles, she gave them space. At 52:30 news broke. Grayson Monroe, once seen as the young wolf of Wall Street, was now the subject of a full federal investigation. Assets froze, luxury cars repossessed, board seats revoked, his passport flagged, the house in the Hamptons seized. Cameras camped outside the family estate. Anchors spoke in sharp tones about fraud wire transfers and years of deceptive practices. But Elara didn't watch the broadcasts. She sat at her desk, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Tea, no sugar, just like her grandfather used to drink. That night, Theo called. His voice was quiet. He's gone. The old man had died in his sleep. No press release, no grand funeral, just silence and wind through the trees of the back garden. Elara didn't cry. She walked out alone to the field behind the house. And there, beneath the wide Texas sky, she placed a single photo on the grass, her 6-year-old painting on the porch, her grandfather behind her pointing at the sky like it was a canvas. "You said color could break silence," she whispered. "You were right." And then she lit a single match. Let the edges curl. Let the fire take the memory home. At 54 they came. Her parents. They didn't call ahead, just appeared in front of the foundation door out of place in their polished clothes, standing among reporters and interns and files stacked to the ceiling. Elara saw them through the glass. She froze. They didn't. Her father stepped inside. He didn't look angry. He didn't look proud. He just looked old. Like a man finally realizing the house he built sat on sand. "May we speak?" he asked. She nodded. He didn't sit. He didn't pace. He just stood, hands in his coat pocket, searching for words no lawyer could prepare. "I watched the hearing," he said. "I saw the tapes. I read what you're building here." Elara didn't speak. He swallowed. "I was wrong. About you, about what mattered." She looked at him hard, unreadable. "I thought strength came from titles, from numbers, from control." He paused. "But maybe it comes from not needing any of that, from standing anyway." She stared, and then he said it. "Maybe you weren't the broken one, Elara. Maybe we were blind, for far too long." Her breath caught. And before she could stop it, before pride or pain could stop it, the tears came. Not sobbing, not shaking, but steady, like rain on a roof that had waited 29 years. She looked up, and for the first time in her life, her father wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her, not as a disappointment, not as a stranger, but as a woman, a leader. A mirror they refused to face for decades. "Thank you," she whispered, not for the apology, but for finally seeing. And in that moment, standing in a room built on rebellion, surrounded by papers, people, and the fire she had lit, Elara knew something had changed. She had not won. This wasn't victory. This was recognition. And that sometimes is a deeper kind of healing. She didn't hug them. They didn't ask. But when they left, her mother touched her hand. Just once. And it was enough. Elara returned to her desk. Outside, the world still spun. Grayson still faced charges, investors still panicked. But inside that basement, inside those stone walls once used to hide darkness, a different kind of fire burned. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that warms, the kind that lights a path. The first report from Foundation M didn't scream. It didn't need to. It was published at dawn without ceremony, with a plain white cover and one title in soft serif: "The Architecture of Disguise, Global Real Estate, and the Veins of Laundering." It was 87 pages long. No color, no branding. But when journalists opened it, when regulators scanned the tables and satellite images and bank overlays, they knew. This wasn't a report. It was a reckoning. Elara stood silently behind a glass wall as the Foundation's data team watched real-time analytics surge, downloads, shares, legal subpoenas triggered in 5 countries. Headlines spun faster than the stock market could breathe. Whispers in Wall Street offices became screams in underground parking lots. She was seated in front of a dozen microphones, not flanked by lawyers, but by researchers in rolled-up sleeves and underlined fatigue. It was Foundation M's first public press conference. Reporters expected fire, expected her to name names, to throw Grayson to the wolves, to stake her claim as the new Monroe. Instead, she leaned into the mic and said, "I'm not here to inherit a throne. I'm here to burn the curtain." They pressed harder. "Ms. Monroe, are you now in control of Monroe Holdings?" "No," she said simply. "Then what do you say to those who believe you're seeking the company for revenge?" She paused. Justice doesn't need medals. It only needs the truth to stop hiding. And with that, she stood, walked off the stage, left a silence louder than any corporate anthem ever written. A knock at the basement door. Soft. Hesitant. Elara didn't turn immediately. She thought it might be Theo again. But when she opened it, she found Harper, the cousin who once called her the family stain. The girl who once mocked her for painting while others were memorizing hedge fund structures. But this Harper looked tired. Not from defeat, from waking up. "I read the report," she said, hands shaking slightly. Elara waited. "I want in." Elara raised an eyebrow. Harper swallowed. "I used to think power was being the best, winning every room. Now, I think maybe power is changing the room." Elara didn't answer, just stepped aside. Let her in. That was the start. Not of redemption, but of rebuilding. Harper wasn't alone. 5 more came that week, all under 30. All former interns, analysts, assistants. They weren't whistleblowers. They were witnesses who had never been asked what they saw. And now they were. They weren't interested in glory. They wanted tools. And Elara gave them something more powerful than tools. She gave them permission. Permission to ask, to question, to redesign. They called themselves the Redraft Unit. They started publishing short-form educational videos called Truth in the Margins. They created interactive databases for young investors. They drafted ethical codes that began circulating through business schools. Elara wasn't the only one leading anymore. And that was the point. Not to be the light, but to multiply it. Later that day, Harper found her in the archival room. "You never told me what that painting meant," she said, pointing to the canvas Elara had hung on the back wall. It was simple, almost childish. A mansion in shadow, but in the attic window a small oil lantern glowing alone. Elara looked at it quietly. "I painted that when I was 15, she said, after Dad told me light was wasted on the weak." Harper blinked. He said that. No, Elara smiled softly, but that's how I heard it. Harper took a step closer. "And now," Elara touched the frame gently. "Now I know light doesn't ask for permission. It just shows up where it's needed." Outside, dusk settled over the foundation. But inside, the basement still glowed. She didn't dress in black. Not because she wasn't mourning something, but because this wasn't a funeral. Elara stood in a sunlit classroom of a forgotten public school near the docks, where textbooks still had pages torn out and the paint peeled from radiators like old skin. This was where she chose to be on the day Grayson Monroe stood trial. Not in court, not in the headlines, but here with a group of 14-year-olds who still thought money was magic and corruption was just something in comic books. The call came at 6317. A contact from the SEC, polite, formal. "We thought you'd want to know he's about to receive the ruling." She didn't ask what the verdict was. She didn't ask if he cried. She just whispered, "Thank you," and hung up. The chalk in her hand was white soft. She turned back to the board and wrote 3 words: power, access, accountability. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Is this like what CEOs use?" Elara smiled, setting the chalk down. "No, this is what we use when no one else is watching." The world elsewhere was watching Grayson squirm in a tailored suit as evidence was projected behind him like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. But Elara was in the back of a classroom letting a student explain how a shell company works using colored paper and a paperclip. The cameras missed this part, and that was fine. Because this wasn't justice for the press. This was light inside systems still unlit. She walked alone on the roof of the school during lunch. Wind tangled her hair. She looked out over the cracked basketball court, over broken windows and burnt-out lampposts. And the voice came low, steady inside her chest. "I didn't break the family. I just let the truth walk in the front door." That's all it had ever been. Not a crusade. Not vengeance. Just light. Back at Foundation M, Theo placed an envelope on her desk. No postmark. Just the letter E written in bold, slanted handwriting. Her name? Elara recognized it instantly. Her grandfather, dead now 6 months. But somehow his words had found their way through time. She didn't open it right away. She stared at it, held it in both hands like it might disintegrate. Then quietly, carefully, she peeled it open. A single page, yellowed, ink slightly blurred in one corner. No flourish, no grand farewell. Just this: Elara. Not everyone is born into legacy, but those who fight for truth, who protect it when it's inconvenient, who hold it even when their hands are shaking, they are the real heirs. Her eyes stayed dry, but her hands were trembling. She stood in front of the Foundation's new welcome wall where employees could leave messages in chalk. She didn't say anything. She just wrote 3 letters, RMH, Robert Monroe Holdings. But someone underneath had scribbled in smaller letters, really made honest. And Elara smiled. That night, she sat alone in the archive room. Not in grief, in stillness. The painting she'd made as a teenager, the one of the glowing attic lantern, hung above her now. But it didn't feel like her painting anymore. It felt like everyone's. A symbol not of rebellion but of restoration. Because legacy, she realized, had never been a chair. It was a light switch. And she'd chosen to flip it on. 6 months had passed, and the name Foundation M was no longer whispered in activist circles, it was spoken aloud in government hearings and international summits. It wasn't born out of ambition. It was born because someone refused to stay silent in the family dining room. Elara Monroe hadn't just created an independent financial investigation unit. She'd cracked a door that had been welded shut for decades and left it open for others to walk through. The first joint report between Foundation M and the International Finance for Clean Trade hit global media like a controlled explosion. Offshore funds, shell companies tied to art auctions manipulated housing developments, names and dates were named. Faces, too. No Monroe was spared, including herself. But that was the point. At Monroe Holdings, no single heir sat at the head of the table anymore. The concept of succession had been incinerated with the ashes of the last quarterly meeting under Grayson's hand. In its place, a 5-person transparency council operated with full disclosure and rotating public audits. For the first time since its founding, the company was not ruled by a bloodline, but by scrutiny. In the main entrance hall where the family crest once hung, there was now only a sentence carved in thick steel and cold truth. A name is not an answer. Integrity is. Elara didn't go to the unveiling. She didn't need to. She was in Brooklyn, sitting cross-legged in a corner of her studio, a chipped mug of coffee by her side, and sunlight pooling onto a half-finished canvas. Her life hadn't grown more luxurious. If anything, it had become more demanding. But it was hers. On the easel, she wasn't painting portraits or landscapes. She was drawing systems' chaotic lines that nodded into darkness and then slowly, carefully broke apart into order. She painted as she listened to voicemails from young whistleblowers, teachers, a retired banker in Switzerland, a data analyst in Nairobi. All of them had one thing in common: they believed the game was rigged. And now, because of her, they weren't alone. She didn't return to the mansion again. But one day, someone sent her a photograph. The once forbidden basement beneath the Monroe estate had been renovated. The safe remained scarred, silent, but its door stood permanently ajar. Skylights had been carved into the ceiling, flooding the room with natural light. The shadows were gone. In place of secrets, there was glass and steel. On one wall, the past is not a prison. It's proof. She didn't respond to the photo, but she saved it. One Thursday afternoon, she sat in on a podcast interview with an independent journalism class. They asked her why she never went public with her inheritance, why she refused to take over Monroe Holdings after winning the legal right to do so. She smiled softly, then said, "I didn't win by taking power. I won by refusing to play the game. I didn't sit in their chair. I built a table no one could flip." She didn't look for applause. She just wanted one person maybe listening alone on a bus to hear that and choose not to stay quiet in their own family meeting. Somewhere someone would. That night, as dusk slid into the Brooklyn sky, she placed a small canvas onto the wall of the Foundation M headquarters. It was the only piece she'd kept from her teenage years, painted when she was 15 before any of this. It showed a house cloaked in black except for one window. Inside that window, a single lamp glowed yellow against the dark. She'd called it "Still Awake." As she stepped back to look at it, she realized something for the first time. It hadn't been just a painting. It had been a warning. And now finally someone had stayed awake long enough to do something. The final moment came without warning. No grand speeches, no music swelling, just a soft photo taken by a school teacher on a field trip to the Monroe estate. A little boy no older than 8 stood in the old basement, now bathed in light. He looked around confused, then asked, Was this a jail? The teacher smiled and said, "No. This is where someone said, 'That's enough,' and meant it." That was the legacy. Not a name, not a chair, but a room where the truth was finally allowed to breathe and no one needed to watch their back again.